Margaret Parker had always been a practical woman. At 65 years old, she'd lived a life of routine and stability in her modest home on the outskirts of a small town in Pennsylvania. Widowed for nearly a decade, her days were simple, tending to her garden, reading her favorite books, and sipping tea while watching the world go by from her front porch. It was a peaceful life, but deep down, Margaret always felt that something was missing. There was a quiet loneliness that settled into her bones, a feeling that had only deepened since her husband passed away. On a chilly autumn afternoon, Margaret decided to clear out the old attic, a task she had been putting off for years. The attic was full of dusty boxes and forgotten memories, things she hadn't touched in decades. As she rummaged through the old keepsakes, memories from her younger years came flooding back. The trinkets from her wedding, photographs of her children when they were little, and even a few childhood toys. But it was a small, nondescript wooden box hidden beneath a pile of old blankets that caught her attention. She didn't recognize it, and the curiosity in her grew. Her hands trembled as she opened the box, revealing a yellowed envelope, sealed and addressed to her, in her mother's handwriting. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. Her mother had passed away over 40 years ago, and the sight of her familiar handwriting brought tears to her eyes. Why had this letter been hidden away for so long? Why had her mother never given it to her? A million questions swirled in her mind as she held the letter in her shaking hands. For a long moment, she sat there, staring at the letter, unsure if she should open it. What secrets could it hold? What truths had her mother hidden from her all these years? As the sun set outside, casting long shadows across the attic, Margaret's fingers gently tore open the seal. The letter inside was fragile, its edges worn and its ink faded, but she could still read the words. "My dearest Margaret," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means I am no longer with you. There is so much I wish I could have told you, but sometimes life doesn't give us the chance to say what we need to say. There is something you need to know about our family, something I never had the courage to tell you when I was alive." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Her hands trembled as she continued reading. Her mother's words revealed long-buried secrets about their family, secrets that Margaret had never imagined. The letter spoke of a hidden inheritance, a life-changing sum of money that had been left to Margaret by a relative she had never known. But there was more. The letter hinted at another mystery, something her mother had never been able to uncover, but urged Margaret to seek out. "I am sorry I kept this from you, Margaret," the letter concluded, "but I did what I thought was best at the time. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me. And I hope that this inheritance will bring you the happiness and security you deserve. Love always, Mum." Margaret sat there in stunned silence, the letter resting in her lap. Her heart raced as the weight of the revelation settled over her. Her mother had kept this secret from her for decades, and now, 40 years later, it was up to her to piece together the puzzle. The money, the mystery, the hidden truths, everything seemed too overwhelming to comprehend. But one thing was clear: Margaret's life was about to change in ways she never could have anticipated. As night fell and the house grew quiet, Margaret made her way downstairs, the letter clutched tightly in her hand. She knew she couldn't ignore what she had discovered. The time had come to confront the past and uncover the truth her mother had hidden for so long. If you're enjoying this story, please make sure to subscribe to Stories of Hope for more incredible, life-changing stories. The morning after discovering the letter, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, her cup of tea untouched and growing cold. Her mind raced with the words her mother had written: a hidden inheritance, family secrets, and the hint of a deeper mystery that her mother hadn't been able to solve. Margaret had always believed her family history was simple. Her father had died when she was young, and her mother had raised her and her siblings with love, but without many resources. They were never wealthy, and Margaret had never suspected there was any hidden fortune or unknown relatives lurking in the shadows. Yet now, everything she thought she knew seemed uncertain. The letter mentioned an inheritance, but it didn't say where or how Margaret could find it. The more she thought about it, the more questions she had. Who was this relative her mother had spoken of? Why hadn't anyone else in her family mentioned them? And why had her mother hidden this information for so long? Unable to sit still any longer, Margaret decided to take action. She rummaged through the attic once again, searching for any other clues that might point her in the right direction. The attic, with its creaky floors and dim lighting, felt more like a treasure trove of forgotten memories than ever before. Hours passed, and just as she was about to give up, Margaret found a small, dusty journal tucked away in an old chest. The cover was worn, and the pages were yellowed with age. As she flipped through it, she realized it had belonged to her mother. Her hands shook as she read through the faded entries. Most were simple notes about daily life, the weather, family dinners, worries about bills. But as Margaret reached the later entries, the tone of the journal changed. Her mother had written about a man named Thomas, someone Margaret had never heard of. "Thomas came to visit today," one entry read. "He brought news of the inheritance again, but I don't know what to make of it. Can I really trust him? Margaret doesn't need to know about this until I'm sure. It feels too complicated, too dangerous, but I feel guilty keeping this from her." Margaret's heart raced. Thomas, who was he? Was he the key to understanding this mystery? And why had her mother been so unsure about him? The journal raised even more questions than the letter had. Determined to learn more, Margaret spent the next several days reaching out to old family friends, combing through legal documents, and even visiting the town's archives. It wasn't easy, especially for someone her age, but the drive to uncover the truth pushed her forward. Her persistence finally paid off when she found an old will, buried deep in the county records. The document was dated nearly 50 years ago and named Margaret as the beneficiary of a large sum of money. But the money had never been claimed. It had been held in trust, and the trustee listed was none other than Thomas, a name that now felt both familiar and mysterious. Who was this Thomas? Why had he never contacted her directly? And why had her mother been so conflicted about him? The deeper Margaret dug, the more she realized that this inheritance wasn't just about money. It was tied to secrets that had been buried for decades, secrets that were about to change her life in ways she couldn't imagine. Her investigation eventually led her to a small town several hours away where Thomas had once lived. Margaret packed a suitcase and set out on the road, her heart heavy with anticipation. She felt a strange mixture of fear and hope, unsure of what she would find, but knowing she had no choice but to continue. When she arrived, she found that the town had changed over the years. Businesses had closed, streets were quieter, and the people seemed distant. But after asking around, she learned that Thomas had passed away several years ago. It was a dead end, or so she thought. Before leaving town, Margaret decided to visit the small library, hoping to find any mention of Thomas or her family in the local history. As she thumbed through old newspapers, she found a series of articles about a scandal that had rocked the town decades earlier. It involved a wealthy family, hidden money, and rumors of betrayal. And at the center of it all was Thomas, the trustee of her mother's hidden inheritance. Margaret's blood ran cold as she read the headlines. "Local trustee accused of embezzling family fortune," the article declared. Thomas had been involved in a legal battle over the very inheritance her mother had mentioned. But it wasn't just about the money. There were accusations of forged documents, manipulation, and even threats. Her hands shook as she realized the full weight of what her mother had kept hidden. This wasn't just a matter of an inheritance. It was a dark chapter in their family's history, one that her mother had shielded her from all her life. The question that haunted Margaret now was, why? Margaret felt a sense of dread gnawing at her as she drove home from the small town. The revelations about Thomas had opened a floodgate of emotions, but they still didn't answer the questions that haunted her the most. Why had her mother kept this from her? And why had she allowed this inheritance to remain hidden, knowing it could have changed their lives? The old letter, the journal, and the newspaper clippings swirled in her mind, forming a confusing puzzle with missing pieces. As she pulled into her driveway, she decided she needed a moment of quiet. But when she entered her home, something was different. Her phone was ringing. Margaret hesitated. Hardly anyone called her these days, and when she picked up the phone, her heart raced with nervous anticipation. "Hello?" she asked, her voice shaky. "Mrs. Parker?" A deep voice responded. "This is David Morgan. I'm an attorney handling the estate of Thomas White. We've recently come across some documents related to your family, and I believe you should come to my office immediately." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. Thomas White, the trustee her mother had mentioned, his name in the news, connected to scandal and mystery. This was it, the final piece of the puzzle. 2 days later, Margaret found herself sitting in a plush leather chair in a high-rise office in the heart of the city. David Morgan, a sharp-looking man in his 50s, sat across from her with a serious expression. "I'm sure this has been a difficult journey for you," he began. "The documents we've found are likely to provide the closure you've been seeking, but I warn you, the truth may be more than you're ready to hear." Margaret felt a shiver run down her spine. "I'm ready. Please, just tell me." Morgan opened a thick folder and slid several yellowed papers across the desk. "These are letters written by Thomas White himself shortly before his death. They reveal the true story behind the inheritance your mother mentioned." Margaret's hands trembled as she picked up the first letter. "To Margaret Parker," it began, and her eyes widened as she recognized the familiar handwriting. The letter explained that Thomas had been a close family friend in his younger years, a fact her mother had never mentioned. But more shockingly, it revealed that Thomas was her biological father, a secret her mother had taken to her grave. Margaret's heart pounded as she read the words. "I loved your mother, but our relationship was complicated by circumstances beyond our control. I was forbidden from claiming you as my own, but I made sure to leave you something in my will, hoping you'd one day find it. I'm sorry, I never had the courage to tell you the truth while I was alive. Please forgive me." Margaret stared at the letter in disbelief. The man her mother had so cryptically mentioned, the man involved in a scandal, had been her father all along. The inheritance wasn't just money. It was a piece of her identity that had been kept from her for decades. "I can't believe it," Margaret whispered. Tears welled in her eyes as the reality of the situation sank in. Her entire life, she had believed she knew who she was. But this revelation changed everything. "There's more," Morgan said gently, handing her another letter. "Thomas left instructions for a substantial inheritance, money that was tied up in legal battles for years, but is now yours, free and clear. But that's not the most important part." Margaret looked at him, her heart heavy with anticipation. "This isn't just about wealth, Margaret. Thomas's final letter reveals something your mother may never have known. The inheritance also includes property, an estate your father owned overseas in Ireland." "Ireland?" Margaret repeated, shocked. Yes, Morgan confirmed. Your father's family was once quite prominent there. The estate has been in trust, waiting for you to claim it. Margaret's mind raced. She had never even been to Ireland, let alone imagined owning an estate there. The thought of traveling to a place so far away, connected to a man she'd never met, seemed overwhelming. Yet there was a deep sense of curiosity rising within her, a yearning to know more about this hidden chapter of her life. What should I do? Margaret asked, feeling more lost than ever. I can't tell you what to do, Morgan replied, his tone kind. But I can say this. Sometimes the past has a way of catching up with us. It's up to you whether you embrace it or let it go. Over the next few weeks, Margaret struggled with her decision. The weight of her mother's secrets and the discovery of her father's true identity were almost too much to bear. She didn't need the money. That wasn't what this was about. It was about closure, about understanding who she really was and the legacy that had been hidden from her. In the end, she booked a flight to Ireland. When she arrived, the sprawling estate took her breath away. The old stone house, set against rolling green hills, looked like something out of a dream. It was both beautiful and haunting, a physical reminder of the life she could have had circumstances been different. Margaret walked through the grand, empty halls, feeling the presence of her father's spirit all around her. As she stood in the overgrown garden, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. The mysteries of her past had been solved, and while it had taken decades to get here, she finally understood the choices her mother had made. Margaret knew now that her life had been shaped by love, sacrifice, and unspoken truths. Margaret returned to her small home in Pennsylvania, feeling forever changed by her journey. The hidden letter in the attic had led her down a path she never expected, but it had also given her something precious, a sense of closure and a deeper understanding of herself. And as she sat on her porch one evening, watching the sunset, she smiled. The secrets of the past had been revealed, and her future, however uncertain, felt bright once more. Thank you for following Margaret's incredible journey. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe to Stories of Hope for more life-changing stories. Don't miss out on our upcoming stories filled with inspiration, hope, and unforgettable twists.